Perfect. All right. Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this Tuesday evening. We're here to talk about everybody's favorite branch of government, the Arizona Corporation Commission. And so we'll be discovering a little bit more about what they do tonight in Arizona and how they impact you as ratepayers and solar customers. As we're kind of welcoming everybody in, we've got a few poll questions that we'd love for you to take a couple moments to answer. They should be showing up on your screen any moment now. We had a lot of RSVPs for this webinar. We had over 120, and so we'd love to just get a rough sense of who we're talking to tonight, what utility you're coming from, if you have solar or not, and if you do have solar, how long you've had it. This just gives us a better idea of who's coming in. So thanks again for joining us, and take a couple moments to do that, and then we'll get started in just a minute or two. Oh, and I love that we can see the live results as they're coming in. That's cool. If you're just joining us, welcome in. We're going to get started in just a minute here. You should see a couple poll questions coming up on your screen. Do me a favor and answer those, and we'll get started in just a minute. Looks like we've got quite a few APS customers tonight, also TEP. Most people here tonight already have rooftop solar. And wow, most people went solar pretty recently in the last few years. That's interesting. Alrighty. Well, if you haven't yet, feel free to finish up answering those questions, but we're going to get started with just a couple logistics first. So we're in a webinar mode. The presenters, we can't see or hear you, but we want to answer your questions. On the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat box and a Q&A box. If you have questions you want us to answer, please use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. You can also use the chat box, but just keep in mind, everybody can see what you say, and so typically, people use that more for just a quick comment or conversation with other attendees. If you want us to answer your question, use the Q&A feature. We will be sending a recording of this webinar as well as a copy of the slides to everybody who RSVP'd, so don't worry too hard about scribbling down notes frantically. We'll get you this information after the fact. If you're somebody who uses closed captions, you can enable that in Zoom by clicking More at the bottom of your screen, click Captions, then Show Captions, select your language of choice, and then hit Save. We'll leave this up for just another moment in case anybody needs to read those instructions. All right, and if we haven't met yet, my name is Adrian Keller. I'm the Arizona Program Director for Solar United Neighbors based here in Phoenix. I'm thrilled to be joined by three champions in the solar world tonight. Jeriel, who works on our policy team here in the West region at Solar United Neighbors. Jess is our program associate in Arizona, is also based out of Phoenix. And then special thanks to Kate, who's joining us from Vote Solar tonight to share her expertise. We really appreciate you being here. So today we'll go over, just to catch everybody up to speed, what is the Corporation Commission? What exactly do they do, and what kind of decisions do they have authority over? Kate's going to talk a little bit about some of the upcoming changes that solar owners and prospective solar owners can expect. There's some big changes coming down the ACC soon for solar customers. And then it's not going to be the main focus of tonight, but since it's very timely and we've been getting flooded with questions, we'll give you an update on what's going on with the federal reconciliation budget bill that was just recently passed and what that means for solar. And then we'll finish up by sharing a little bit more about some actions you can take to get involved and help advocate for some better solar policies. I also want to just be really honest and straightforward with everybody who's attending tonight. The updates we're sharing aren't very good news. It's not all roses and sunshine for solar policy in Arizona or nationwide right now. It's actually a really tough time for the industry, and we're seeing some layoffs and some really difficult decisions that folks have been having to make. We're not sharing this all with you to discourage you or bum you out. We want to empower you with knowledge so that you can be effective advocates. And the good news is solar isn't going anywhere. We've had some setbacks recently, but solar is strong. The economics are very much on our side, and solar is only going to continue to grow, albeit maybe at a little bit of a slower pace than it would have. So the Arizona Corporation Commission, sometimes referred to as Arizona's fourth branch of government because it was established in the Arizona Constitution, is Arizona's Public Utilities Commission. It's made up of 5 commissioners who are elected statewide for 4-year terms. And Arizona is a little unique. In a lot of states, their public utilities commissioners are appointed by the governor, or maybe they are elected, but it's nonpartisan. But we're in a little bit of a unique spot where we have elected partisan commissioners, and that definitely presents some opportunities and some challenges, depending on what you're trying to get past. The ACC handles a lot. They deal with corporations and business regulation, water, mines. But what we're focusing on mostly tonight is their rate-making authority, their regulation of electric utilities, and what they have to say as far as solar policies that affect you. There's definitely been some challenges at the Corporation Commission as far as solar policy goes. I think it's fair to say that recent decisions have been pretty hostile to rooftop solar. Commissioners have passed new fees on solar. They've reduced the solar compensation rate that you get for sharing excess electricity. And they've made very public statements that they're not big fans of rooftop solar. So that's made things tough. I think it's also fair to say that this commission, especially in the last few years, really has felt increasingly political. The Arizona Corporation Commission is not immune to the trends we're seeing across the state and across the nation. We live in very partisan, very divided times. But I want to be super clear that political party affiliation doesn't determine your support for solar. We've seen poll after poll that shows broad majorities of people from across the political spectrum do support solar. So your political party alone, that's not the issue here. But hyperpartisanship can definitely harm a lot of the progress that we're trying to make. Another big challenge, of course, is a lot of Arizonans don't know what the ACC is or what it does or its impact on their daily life. When we talk to voting experts, it's pretty clear that a lot of people skip those races on their ballot. And so that can cause a little bit of a lack of accountability. There's sort of this missing link between the commissioners and the decisions they're making and the voters, the ratepayers, you and I, who elect them, and they should be accountable to us. And I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that the utilities and other companies regulated by the corporation also have a lot of power. They have a lot of money, a lot of legal teams to work through these rate cases and get past what they want to. And so it can definitely feel like an uphill battle at times when we're trying to pass more equitable solar policy. Now in Arizona, we have monopoly utilities, not exclusively. So you may be served by a rural electric co-op or SRP, which is its own can of worms. But if you're an APS, TEP, or UNS customer, it's a monopoly utility. So you can't really choose who your provider is unless you move. In exchange for that, they're regulated by this corporation commission, who's voted in by us, and their job is to regulate the utilities on behalf of us. Some of the big areas where they have a direct impact in our lives is the electricity rates we pay. If you have solar, what rate are you getting for any solar that you're not using that's going back to the grid? Those decisions are made by the ACC. If utilities want to pass new charges or fees or get a new power plant built, oftentimes those decisions all need to be approved by the ACC first. So they have a lot of power and authority and ability to affect the affordability, clean energy, and just general energy equity in our lives. To give you a couple examples, Arizona is the sunniest state in the nation. I often get asked, why don't we have community solar, which if you're unfamiliar, allows renters and others to subscribe to community solar farms and receive bill discounts in exchange for that. We don't have community solar because the Corporation Commission has failed to pass a policy statement that would allow for true community solar to take off in Arizona. If you've seen your rates go up recently, I know I have. I'm an APS customer. They went up 9% last year, 9% the year before that. Those rate increases only happen because your corporation commissioners approve them. If you're an APS customer and you have solar, you're paying a new fee every month. It's called a grid access charge. You may have seen that line item on your bill that's exclusively charged to solar customers and was recommended and approved by the Corporation Commission. So just to give you a rough idea of some of these decisions they make, some of the policy fights that we get involved in with the Corporation Commission and where we're at. So I'd love to hand it over to Kate to talk about what's coming up this summer.
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some proposed changes that you have the opportunity to weigh in on. And to start with, I think most folks on this webinar probably know that there's two categories of solar customers as the result of a commission decision in 2017. And depending on when you installed solar, you're compensated differently for the energy that is exported to the grid. So previously, customers with solar were compensated for energy that exported to the grid with a credit for each kilowatt hour of energy that could be used to offset the purchase of a kilowatt hour on your energy bill. And decision 75859 in 2017 ended net metering for new solar customers. Anyone who installed solar before then is allowed to remain on the net metering rate for 20 years from the date that you connected your solar to the grid. So that means if you connected your solar installation in 2015, you'll be on net metering until 2035. And the rate that replaced net metering is called the Resource Comparison Proxy, or the RCP rate. And the RCP rate applies to new solar customers, but it also affects everybody ultimately, because when legacy customers who are on that net metering rate reach the end of that 20-year period, most likely, we expect that everyone will transition to the RCP rate. So if it doesn't affect you now, it could in the future. And the value of the RCP rate is set based on the proxy cost of the utility scale solar installation. So it's an estimate of how much would it have cost to build a utility scale solar farm instead of purchasing this kilowatt hour of energy from somebody with rooftop solar. And the commission created this rate as a way to value energy exported to the grid. And when the commission created the rate, it recognized that immediately cutting the export rate from net metering, which effectively compensates people at the retail rate, to a lower value would have a severe impact on the solar industry. And also that it's not fair to people who weren't able to install solar before the decision changed the rates. So at the time, the commission determined that it was really important to have a gradual transition from net metering to this new export rate. And so they decided that the RCP should step down over time by no more than 10% each year. So since then, the commission has approved a step down of about 10% each year in the export rate, with one exception. That exception was in 2020, when the commission recognized that families were facing a lot of uncertainty, rising costs, supply chain issues were making it kind of difficult to get things, more expensive to get things. And so the commission paused the step down that year, just in recognition that there was a lot going on, and that's one way to mitigate the impact on families and their electric bills. So it's a really important tool that the commission gave itself to make sure that the rate doesn't step down more than 10% each year, but that it can approve a step down of less than 10% in order to make sure that transition remains smooth and doesn't have impacts on families. And so, a lot of this news is dispiriting, but I also wanted to call out just an example where hearing from you really made a difference at the commission. The commission recently considered making some changes to the RCP rate in 2023, when the commission opened a docket to explore the value of solar. And it was really driven by one commissioner who proposed cutting the RCP rate by 40 to 50% immediately. So way more than that 10% step down. And he also wanted to reverse legacy status for net metering customers. And many of you, I'm sure many of you on this webinar, turned up at the commission to provide public comment, to tell them what you thought of that, or wrote to commissioners. And it's a really great example of why it's important to be involved, because the commission did hear your objections. And earlier this year, the commission staff recommended closing that docket without accelerating cuts to the RCP. So that's, an important reason to speak up. But we are now facing a proposal from both APS, TEP, and Unisource Electric to step down the RCP rate for new customers starting in fall 2025 by 10%. And the 10% step down, it's more gradual certainly than a bigger reduction to the RCP, but it really chips away at Arizona families' ability to save money on their utility bills with solar. And combined with some of the other impacts that we're going to talk about that are affecting solar right now, it really dramatically undermines the value of investment in solar in Arizona going forward. And so this is just a quick visual to show how the RCP has changed over time. So when it was created in 2017, the RCP was set to equal the retail rate that you pay for purchasing energy from the utility. And so that was somewhere between 9.5 and 13 cents at the time. The rate has stepped down by 10% most years. And so the proposed rate for the end of 2025, depending on the utility, is somewhere between 5 and 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So much lower than it was. And the gray bars here just show you what the retail rate for purchasing electricity is from each utility. So, depending on what season it is, what time of day it is, what rate structure you're on, your price per kilowatt hour of energy from the utility is going to vary. So it just shows you the range of, what a kilowatt hour costs from each utility. And as you can see, we're now in a situation where the proposed resource comparison proxy rate for exports is well below the retail rate that people are paying to purchase electricity from the utility. Next slide. So because I know there will be questions about it, I'm going to just share one additional note that really only applies to APS customers right now about the grid access charge. So the grid access charge is a new additional charge applicable to APS customers with solar that was implemented in March 2024. And the charge was introduced at the very tail end of APS's rate case, where they proposed increasing rates for all customers, and approved by the commission last year. And so the charge is, it applies to every customer with solar, all 200,000 APS customers with rooftop solar, but how it appears on your bill does look different if you are a legacy net metering customer versus a non-legacy customer. So for non-legacy solar customers, if the RCP applies to you, it's a little bit more straightforward. It appears as a separate line item on your bill under the name grid access charge, and it's based on the size of your solar installation. So for most customers, it equals an average of $2 to $3 per month, but it is going to depend on how large your solar installation is. For a legacy net metering customer, the solar charge is collected through increases to the rates that you pay for electricity service, including all of the subcomponents of your rate. So there's the monthly service charge, energy charges, and in some cases, a demand charge. So the legacy customer solar charge is also called the grid access charge sometimes, but APS doesn't label it specifically on your bill. And so it is collecting that same additional $2 to $3 a month on average, but you're not going to see it as the grid access charge on your bill. I'll just mention too that Vote Solar, as well as Arizona and the Arizona Attorney General, have appealed the commission's decision to approve this charge to the Arizona Court of Appeals, because this rate discriminates against customers with solar, who are now required to pay more for the same amount of electricity service as someone without solar, just because they have solar panels on their roof. So the appeal is making its way through the Arizona Court of Appeals. And we don't know whether the Court of Appeals will reach a decision before or after the conclusion of APS's current rate case. But I just did want to mention that is, we have an appeal underway, and that's a charge that, APS customers are probably familiar with. It's separate from the issue that we're discussing with the export rate here. Next slide.
Okay, so did somebody say Jess to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I wonder if we might be able to address some questions in the Q&A before we move to this slide, just because there's a couple coming in specifically about the RCP, and
Yeah, absolutely.
It might make sense for Kate to answer those, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
Okay, and I'm happy to read them out if it's helpful. There's two questions specifically around this. And one is, please explain in more detail the way the RCP rate is determined and why it is lower. I'm not understanding what the logic behind it is. And Kate, the second question is, what is the rationale for cutting the RCP?
Yeah, good questions. So the RCP rate is the way it's calculated, it's supposed to approximate the cost of purchasing a kilowatt hour of energy from a utility scale solar project. And so it is looking at the value of, what would the utility have paid otherwise to purchase energy from a utility scale solar farm instead of purchasing it from, its own customers who are generating power on the grid. And so it does include an adder, obviously, a solar farm that's somewhere far away from where people live produces power, but that power also has to be transmitted across the transmission system. It has to be, sent across the distribution system to actually reach the homes and businesses that use it. So a kilowatt hour of power produced locally on your rooftop, right next to your house where your neighbors can use it, is not the same value as a kilowatt hour that's produced, say 200 miles away, where there's nobody there who needs the kilowatt hour without also paying for the cost to send it, across the state. So there is an adder for that avoided transmission and distribution system costs. And so the RCP rate is supposed to step down over time to eventually reach that what's called the avoided cost of energy. So I'll add that our position in that case was that the calculation the commission approved is not including all of the values that rooftop solar provides. It's certainly not including things like the value of having local energy that you can use for resilience when there's grid blackouts, or other environmental, health, social benefits, things like that. So it is much lower than the full suite of benefits that rooftop solar energy does provide. But that is the calculation that the commission approved. And so rather than transitioning immediately to that lower rate, the commission determined it should step down over time.
And there is one follow-up question asking if the RCP change applies to all solar customers or just to new customers.
So the RCP change at the moment would apply only to new solar customers. Anyone who receives is credited for energy that you export to the grid at the RCP is allowed to lock in the rate that's effective when you install solar for 10 years. So for example, someone who installed solar in 2017, right at the start of this, can keep the RCP rate that was effective. If you're an APS customer, that would be 12.9 cents per kilowatt hour for 10 years until 2027. This particular RCP change would only apply to new customers who are installing solar and could then lock in that rate until 2035. You probably notice, depending on when you installed solar, that there are folks who are reaching that end of that 10-year period. Not this year, but starting in 2027. And so going forward, the commission could determine that the new RCP rate also applies to existing solar customers once you've reached the end of that lock-in period. We're not there yet. So this new rate would only be for new customers who are trying to decide whether or not to install solar.
Jeriel, were there any other questions that we wanted to discuss now regarding the RCP and the grid access charge?
There's a few other questions, not specifically related to the RCP. So Jess, I think it'd be great if you continue us on, and then Adrian, I might suggest we pause before jumping into how people can play a role and answer a few of those questions before we shift focus, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'm not hearing any objections, so I'm going to assume that we're going with that. So luckily, this is the last grim slide that we have to share. After that, we will discuss your questions, as Jeriel just mentioned, and then she'll be going into kind of next steps and ways that you, as constituents of the ACC, can be empowered to make change going forward. But the reason we wanted to bring this up is just because it is so timely and there are a lot of questions surrounding it. So, of course, the One Big Beautiful Bill was passed by Congress last week and it was signed into a law. And that is effectively our budget reconciliation. And so for those of you who are interested in going solar but haven't done so yet, this is going to impact you pretty enormously, and that 30% residential tax credit is going to be removed by the end of this year. And so for those of you who don't know what that is, that basically says that 30% of the cost of your solar installation will then be a tax credit for the following year when you do apply for your taxes during tax season. So for example, if you were to spend $15,000 tomorrow to install solar panels, roughly $5,000 would be your tax credit next year. And so if you owe $2,000, but you have a $5,000 tax credit, you no longer owe. Unfortunately, that $3,000 of excess doesn't go back into your pocket right then. It's rolled over into the following year so that you can use that as a continuing tax credit until you've exhausted all the funds. But the important thing to note about that is that you will want to discuss this with a tax expert just to make sure that you are understanding all the ramifications. And also something to note is that if you have non-taxable income, so for example, Social Security, or you're on disability, you are unfortunately not eligible for this either because your income isn't taxed. So that might impact whether or not you decide to go solar. One upside to the new wording of the bill as it was passed is that previously it was based on systems that were going to be put into installation and given permission to operate by the end of this year. But luckily, as things stand, you have to pay for it by the end of this year. So that gives you a little bit more time in order to decide if you want to go solar and still be eligible. That said, there is a little uncertainty as to whether or not the IRS's interpretation will continue that going into next year. And ultimately, why this is so timely is if you are interested in going solar, we do recommend that you do so sooner than later if you're able to, just because you'll be eligible for that 30% tax credit. As well as if you do it now, you should be able to get, or you could be able to get in there before the RCP step down. So you'll get a higher rate of payback for what you are putting onto the grid. And for those of you who are solar advocates at a broader sense, so you like to see your utility, for example, have a larger profile dedicated to solar as opposed to other energy sources, the 30% commercial solar tax credit will also be phased out, but at the end of 2027 as opposed to now. So there is more time to put utility scale solar into effect, which Kate was discussing as to what that RCP is based off of. That said, after construction, if construction hasn't begun before the end of this year, there's something called a foreign entity of concern restriction. And effectively, that means that there's going to be a guideline that if a certain percentage of the solar installation is sourced from a foreign entity of concern, so China, for example, that they might be ineligible. And that creates a lot of uncertainty for people who are deciding whether or not to install these utility scale solar arrays, which are measured in megawatts as opposed to kilowatts. So it's a very big array. And these also impact people who are eligible for direct pay. So that includes people who want to go solar from a nonprofit, a congregation, or a school. And so those are organizations that are, of course, putting back into their communities. But with this uncertainty, they may not decide to go solar because they can't necessarily count on what the direct pay and whether or not that will persist because of these unclear regulations. And then were there any questions pertaining to federal guidelines that people have put in the chat at all, if anybody knows? If not, I think we can kick it to whomever to answer the ones about TEP. I think those are the main ones.
Yeah, I can take those. I see a couple of questions about TEP. So the first one I'll address is a question of, isn't it lower for TEP to produce electricity only because TEP still insists on using mostly fossil fuels to generate it? And did they take this into account when they decided to lower the value of the solar energy that is rooftop generated? And this one's specific to TEP, but I think it can apply to other utilities as well. And if you look at the actual costs of what it costs to build a new energy resource today, we're actually at a point where clean energy resources like wind and solar are less expensive than fossil fuel resources, especially less expensive than continuing to run old fossil fuel resources that require maintenance and upkeep and fuel costs. And really, even without accounting for those federal tax credits, clean energy resources are the clear, more affordable choice. So, like Adrian said, that's some good news that this, transition is inevitable based only on the economics of clean energy resources. And, it takes more time than we'd like for that transition to happen. And so it's really just a question of the timing. When and there's some questions here as well about the retail rate and why is that, if clean energy resources are more affordable, why is the retail rate so much higher than what you're being paid to export clean energy to the grid? And I think the answer to that question is that the retail rate that you pay includes the cost of generating electricity, but it also includes all of the costs associated with actually delivering that electricity to your house. And so it's the generation costs of the power plant. It's the cost of maintaining the power plant. It's the cost of transmission lines that need to be built across the state. It's the cost of the distribution system, which actually delivers the power to your neighborhood and then to your house. And it's also the cost of new resources that need to be built to meet demand for electricity. So, you might have heard about how there's just incredible demand for new electricity resources right now, in part because data centers, for example, are using a lot of energy. People are building data centers very quickly, and utilities are building energy resources very quickly to supply power to their customers, and including those large energy users like data centers. So that retail rate that you pay is, all of those costs combined. And so, our take is that the RCP, the calculation that's used to determine what customers are compensated for energy they export to the grid, just isn't a fair accounting of all of those different benefits that rooftop solar provides, all of the costs that the utility would be spending to produce energy that it helps to avoid. It does feel like it's not fair to rooftop solar customers if during those on-peak periods when electricity is in huge demand, it's hot, everybody's trying to cool their home because they just got home, you're paying over 30 cents per kilowatt hour for energy if you're an APS customer. But if you export energy to that grid, that same kilowatt hour is only worth 6 cents. So there is a really big discrepancy in terms of how you're charged for electricity and the value that customers are provided.
There was a follow-up. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a follow-up question in the chat to what you were just saying, Kate, about if this is true that new generation is less under clean energy, why is there still less than net metering and consumers paid at much lower return to the consumer investment and expenditure?
Yeah, so I think that question is, why is the RCP the way it is? And the answer is really that was a policy decision by the Arizona Commission in 2017. Most states do still have net metering policies in place. There are a few other states that have transitioned to something like the RCP rate, but they're generally calculated differently. Arizona is an outlier when it comes to compensating customers for solar energy because it's much more common across the country to have kept net metering in place.
Somebody wouldn't mind reading the next question. I'm losing track a little bit.
Maybe since we're on the subject of TEP, where do you stand on the idea of Tucson buying out TEP to make it publicly owned and therefore answerable to the residents of Tucson instead of TEP's out-of-state and mostly out-of-country investors?
Yeah, really good question. So for folks who are unfamiliar, TEP or I should say the city of Tucson is in the process right now of considering what it might look like to purchase TEP and make it a municipal utility essentially. This is something that happens across the country. It can be very expensive and challenging to do. And we've seen municipal utilities that are great. We've seen municipal utilities that are less than great. I think the crux of the issue, and you mentioned it in your question, is accountability, is who's making those decisions and who are they accountable to. Like I mentioned, like some municipal utilities aren't so great because they're smaller and run by the city doesn't mean those city leaders are really listening really earnestly to their constituents. But on the other hand, it can work much better since it is more locally owned, more local control, and the residents have a more direct say into the process. So Sun as a nonprofit, we're not really taking a position on that particular issue, but watching it closely and excited to see what happens.
All right. One more time in the chat is Deward was asking, that doesn't answer who's in the way of net metering in Arizona. And I think ultimately it was the ACC's decision. So the ACC is in the way in that they made a policy decision, a regulatory decision to remove that. And then it, of course, costs the utility more money if they're paying that higher rate. So they were the ones ultimately lobbying for that. And so I think it's a little bit of both parties who played a role in that decision, if that's accurate to say.
Yeah, and to be clear, like none of this is particularly set in stone. I mean, a future commission, if they wanted to make changes to this methodology, if they wanted to, bring back some form of net metering, like those are things that are within the commission's purview. Like we're operating within the system that's been set up that was passed in 2017, but future commissioners can make different decisions if they want.
Okay, and then Glenn had asked, what's up with APS's proposed solar fee, which I'm assuming is about the grid access charge. So if I would say that we've already answered that, but Glenn, feel free to put a question in there again if you don't feel it's been answered the way you'd like, and to clarify what you're looking for there.
Yeah, and just
So,
really quick summary, in case you missed it, like the grid access charge, this was a specific fee to solar customers that was passed by the ACC last year, only applies to solar customers. In our view, very unnecessary and unconstitutional, and it's being challenged in court currently.
okay. The next one was, in my research for going off grid, I discovered that yes, there are certain appliances that can be removed from the grid. Not a good investment for me under my circumstances, but some might benefit. There's a solar split AC that is designed to be solar with battery backup. The option might be worth it for people having to replace their units. Okay, so thank you for that, Joel. So I'll go ahead and click that as answered. And then how does APS and the ACC justify buying power for 6 cents and then reselling it for 30 cents? That's the question we are all asking ourselves.
Great question. Yeah, I think that's kind of the crux of the issue. Like that's why we're not big fans of this whole RCP process and the continued reductions. I mean, if you have solar panels, you're producing more energy than you're needing. APS is buying that power for what, around 6 cents, and then selling it to your neighbors if it's during the day for up to 30 cents. And so oftentimes we hear arguments from anti-solar activists or from utilities who claim that rooftop solar is somehow costing non-solar customers money. And that's just not true, especially in Arizona. You said it just exactly right in your question. It's hard to understand, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
There's more sentiment of that in the Q&A as well, so we're all of the same mind. So will the solar tax credit be phased out for current solar customers due to the bill? As we understand it, no, because it is, you of course have paid for it already since you already have solar, and that will be before the deadline of the end of this year. That said, it's unclear how the IRS will determine that or how they'll interpret the law. And so since we aren't tax experts, we can't say that definitively, but I would definitely suggest talking to somebody who can interpret that as that changes, because I know right now things are a little bit in limbo as people are determining what is what and what is going to be the future of that solar tax credit ultimately.
Yeah, and I think I'd add, I would keep all of the paperwork associated with your installation, documenting, when you paid for the installation, when it was connected to the grid, just to make sure you have documentation backing all that up.
Okay, and it looks like the last question is, did no tax on Social Security pass with the reconciliation bill? No, that was prior. So the tax credit is specifically for taxable income. If you were a nonprofit, for example, they are non-taxed. And so there was something in the Inflation Reduction Act that allowed them to get direct pay. So they get a check for that 30% since they're not taxed. But for individuals at the residential level who aren't taxed, this is kind of how it's been, I think, for as long as I've been aware of this policy.
And I think if this is a question about the taxes related to Social Security payments specifically, I'll just say I'm wholly unqualified to answer that question.
Okay, it looks like we got through the questions. So Jeriel, if you want to take it away.
Great. Well, hi, I'm Jeriel, and I have the pleasure this evening of shifting our focus a little to talk about how individual ratepayers can play a role in shaping Arizona's energy future. So just really quickly, if you're able, in the chat, if you have ever submitted a comment to the ACC in a formal capacity, if you just like put a plus sign or a thumbs up or a yes or whatever, I just love to see how many of the folks on this call today have had an opportunity to engage in this way. And the reason that I'm asking that is because public comments are one of the most important ways you can influence what the ACC does. So while utility lawyers, experts bring technical and financial data when they're considering a case, commissioners also need to hear what these decisions means for regular people, the consumers who are paying the cost, utilizing the energy for your everyday lives. So comments really do help humanize the process. It tells the stories that numbers just can't. It can also be easier for organizations or commissioners to dismiss organizational comments based on their view of organizations or perception of where an organization might fall. And so when lots of individuals submit comments with a wide range of stories, viewpoints, and perspectives, it can be really difficult to dismiss. So there is a huge value add when lots of individuals are submitting comments when they are considering a case in front of them. And I think we can move to the next slide. So just really quickly, I want to talk about some of the different ways to comment. There are a few ways you can add your perspective and requests when the ACC is considering a case, but they are weighted a little bit differently than others. So you'll see here in the orange, the two orange bullet points are the ones that are entered into the official docket. They have to be considered in an official way, in an official capacity. They must be reviewed by the commissioners. So a written comment in that form is obviously the easiest. If you haven't submitted a comment before, you can do it right from home. It's fairly easy once the process has been explained. And it's basically writing from your perspective and sending in that comment online. And then if you're feeling a little more up to it, you can always provide oral testimony as well. And what that does is it really allows you to speak during a meeting or a public hearing where they're considering the case live. And it just adds an element of emotion. It adds the ability to humanize a comment. It puts faces to stories. It just creates this additional context to a comment that wouldn't have been provided otherwise. And then still very valuable, but maybe not in a public comment or official capacity. There's a couple other ways that you can interact. So you could email the commissioners directly with direct outreach with your perspective. What we are trying not to do is to create a template form for you to sign your name onto and we submit. And while there are reasons and times and capacities to do that, we really want commissioners to hear from people, hear the words that people are coming up with. What are their stories? What are they saying? We want them to feel that emotion and the heart in it. And so you can email them directly with your own thoughts. It's not entered into the official record, so it does not become a part of the case. Another thing that you could do that really helps raise visibility is social media. So if there's something on this webinar this evening, maybe it's the RCP rates, maybe it's the grid access charge, maybe it's something else that really frustrates you or stood out to you or was highlighted that you would want to share, you can share that publicly, build awareness, and you can even tag commissioners. They are active on social media channels, and you could tag them and say, hey, what is the deal with this? I really don't like this. Here's how it's impacting me. Here's how it's impacting my family and friends. The only caveat I would put there, if you are going to share on social media, is that because it's a public forum, you might get something back from one of the commissioners and they might share a different perspective. And so you might be inviting a conversation and engaging in a back and forth. And if you are still on with us in just a few moments, I'm going to highlight what does a good comment look like and what does a not so good comment look like, just so we can think through a little bit. Not wanting to troll, not wanting to just be mad for the sake of being mad, but how do we send something in that's really going to make a difference, even if it is coming from a place of feeling upset, and how do we turn that into a really powerful comment? And I think we can move to the next slide. Thanks. All right, so just to highlight a little bit more some of the different roles we play. So as individuals, you individuals attending this webinar who might submit a comment, residents, ratepayers, solar customers, your lived experience really matters. And then there's organizations like ours, Vote Solar or Solar United Neighbors, and many others who can submit formal positions, amplify public voices. We can file legal briefs. There's things that we can do. And then there's official interveners, and that can look like organizations like ours again. So we can officially intervene, and we have in some cases. It can look like school districts, it can look like local governments, lots of different entities can officially intervene. And that's when it becomes a little more complex in terms of there are parties to the case. You can submit expert testimony. There is opportunity to cross-examine, and the process that's a part of the reason why the process is drawn out for a length of time, because that takes time. But I will say that each of these is more valuable as a tool when they are symbiotic and happening together. So when organizations are saying something, when there are official interveners, and when there are individuals submitting comments, all of those things are compounding and can lead to a more important effect. And we can move to the next slide. Okay, so just to reiterate, submitting written comments shows commissioners that real people are paying attention. And because their positions are elected, that you will also likely be voting in their next election. And I think that's what is really unique in terms of an opportunity that you have in Arizona and is not available in many other states, which is if you take the time to submit a comment, if you take the time to let them know how you're feeling about a particular case, you're probably also going to take the time to vote. And so they're going to be paying attention to these comments, maybe not just from oh, this is how they're feeling about this case, but also what is the temperature check of how people are feeling about our role as commissioners and how we're doing our job. And so engagement and interaction in these cases is just even more elevated because they know that you're paying attention and that you're likely going to be paying attention when the time comes to make the decision. And I think the value of that is important because of a lot of the questions you're asking earlier today, which is, how can they do this? Why are they doing this? Who's the one causing the problem? Well, if you have concerns, then you also have the ability to help make a decision in there. And so that's just, I guess, the last plug that I would put in there. And then finally, one well-written, well-timed comment really can make a difference. So what we've seen in other cases is folks turn out and they create their own comments. And then those comments are brought up when the commissioners are discussing the case later. And so they're direct quoting comments that individuals have submitted because they have to review them. And by reviewing them, those comments are impacting them. And they're using those lived experience arguments in considering the cases in discussions back and forth with each other. And so it really can just make a difference, even if it doesn't ultimately change the case in the end. And so with that, here's how we're going to kind of transition the last few minutes of the evening. I've definitely seen in my peripheral some chatter happening in the chat and maybe some questions coming in. So we're going to jump back over to those. And then afterwards, we're going to do a really quick comment writing workshop. And it's going to be about 15 to 10 minutes. It's not going to be super long, but it's just going to walk us through how do we write a comment that can that maybe holds a little bit more weight. What are things that we might consider, and how might I draft that myself for you? So I will hand it back to the panel and the team for comments and questions.
Yeah, let's take a look here at the Q&A. There's a good one. Has the APS rate increase been approved, or is there still time to comment? Plenty of time, Glenn. So there's been a lot of rate cases, so they tend to merge together a little bit. There was one that was just approved last year. That was the 9% increase. And then APS just filed for their next increase, which is a 14% increase. That process takes months. It can take over a year for those rates to actually kick in. And so yes, plenty of time. And then is there a docket? Do we know, Kate, for that case already?
That's a good question. There is a docket number. I can drop it in the chat. And, I was going to say for the question about how can you be notified about these important decisions, I would also recommend just making sure, presumably you're on Sun's mailing list because you heard about this webinar, or hopefully Vote Solar is one of our mailing lists. But if you're getting emails from us, you'll definitely hear about opportunities to comment and deadlines that are coming up.
Yeah, and then another really good question from Stephen. Are there protests or demonstrations planned? Stephen, I would love to talk to you more about that. I think that's really interesting. As you can see, like on this picture here, what Kate mentioned earlier when the ACC was considering making some really intense changes and ending grandfathering status, a lot of us kind of stepped in and helped organize this press conference and got a lot of media attention. I think that's one other thing that Gerald didn't mention that can be really impactful is not only, you know, staging a protest or something like this, but just getting some more media attention. I think a lot of people don't know the ACC is doing what they're doing. And so, yes, I would love to talk to you more about doing something again outside of the ACC, get some reporters there and shine a light a little bit on what these commissioners are actually deciding. I will say also, we don't know the exact date yet that the ACC will make this upcoming decision about the 10% RCP step down. So no, we don't have a specific demonstration or anything planned, but very open to that.
If I could hop in here for that as well, there's an organization called Third Act. And while it's in September, there's something called Sunday. And so it's like an organizing push to have some sort of, if not demonstration, then some sort of educational piece that surrounds things that pertain to clean energy. And so, Stephen, if you were interested in organizing something through Third Act for Sunday, for example, especially dependent on where you're at. I know that in Northern Arizona, for example, in Flagstaff, they're planning to do an event, but you might be interested in doing an event in your area. That might be a way to do a demonstration that has a little bit more organizational backing.
And I'm just gonna put this is Jess and I's email. Um, Stephen, if you'd like to coordinate about that, I'd love to meet with you, talk more about it. I think that was the last one, right? Or am I missing some? Looks like it. All right, Jeriel, shall we proceed?
Let's go for it. All right, and I think we can jump to the next slide. So, as I mentioned earlier, I just really wanted to spend a few minutes talking about what makes a strong comment. And so, in order to talk about that, we gave an example first of what makes a poor comment. And so, this is not a guessing game. Is this poor? Is this not? I am unilaterally saying this is a poor comment. And in the chat, if folks would like to put in, I would love to hear just like if you've got any thoughts. Why is this a poor comment? And I'll read it out loud while y'all are typing. So this comment is, this whole thing is ridiculous. The utility companies are ripping us off and the commission isn't doing anything about it. I can't afford solar now and it's the ACC's fault. You need to stop letting them get away with this. So if there's anything in there that someone would like to offer in terms of like, why might this not be the best comment? What maybe not great about this? And we don't have to keep guessing for long. I can take us into some just answers. If you click, we should see some things pop up, which is this comment is pretty emotional. So there's definitely an angry tone with no constructive ask. It's vague, so it lacks detail or personal context. It's not personalized. There's nothing that specifically says, you know, why this person in particular might suffer. And so it becomes ineffective. It doesn't explain why the policy is harmful and what is at a loss as a result. So that's the kind of comments that we are trying to avoid. Or if folks have submitted comments like this in the past, we'd love to offer some additional thought and context for how you might improve a comment so that years will be considered maybe a little bit more in the next time you submit. So if we move to the next slide, we're going to give you an example of a good comment. So this good comment reads, I live in wherever you live, and I've been planning to install solar for over a year to lower my energy bills and help protect my family from rising costs. But every time I get close, the rules change again. Between the drop in export rates and the added grid access fees, it's become harder to make the numbers work. It feels unfair that people like me, who are just now in a position to afford solar, are being punished for not being able to install it sooner. Families like mine shouldn't be left out just because we didn't have the resources earlier. I urge the Commission to keep solar a viable and affordable option for working families by maintaining fair export rates and avoiding new charges that make going solar harder for everyday people. So again, if we click once more, just a couple of things that make this a strong comment. It's personal, so it explains how the issue affects them with specificity, and it's clear. So it makes a respectful ask with clarity as to why. And I would say that when submitting a comment, I don't think that brevity is always the best. Of course, you don't want to, you don't need to write a novel, right? But giving enough context so that you can really give some answers is really valuable. And if we go to the next slide, here's a couple of prompts that you can consider when you're drafting a comment. I just want to explain a few of them. So in terms of who you are, what community do you represent? When I ask that question, it's, are you a member of a working family and you've got kids? Are you, living on a fixed income and so you don't have the same ability to navigate rising utility costs? Do you represent a neighborhood association where you know that this neighborhood is representative of lower income folks who might be able to benefit from lower utility costs? There's all kinds of things that can give your perspective something unique to offer. And I just really want to challenge you to think about that, because I think sometimes we think, oh, I'm just like everyone. There's nothing like unique or special about my perspective or my story. And I would say there probably really is. It's just, what is that thing? So of course, like when you're drafting, also considering how these decision and policies affect you. And I would ask that if you're one of the significant amount of people on this webinar this evening who already went solar, and so maybe you're not going to feel an impact immediately, right? Maybe the RCP charge or the RCP rate isn't going to necessarily impact you when it steps down again. Again, if the fact that like your compensation rate is lower to what the utilities charge is, if the fact that a grid access charge is something that is possible that could impact you, if any of these things, have really stood out to you this evening, I would still encourage you to write a comment. Say like, if I hadn't been able to, this is what would have happened. Because what you're doing again is you're showing them that we're paying attention and we're going to be following these cases, and we're really watching to see how they start to interact with the way that individuals are standing up and making these asks and requests. So even if you think this may not immediately impact you right now, I would still really encourage you to write a comment because it will help everyone in Arizona. And then finally, when you're making your draft, what would you like the ACC to do? So most important, don't forget to make the ask. What is it you want them to do? Do you want them to protect families by not stepping down the RCP rate? What is the ask that you are making very directly so that they know? And I think with that, what comes next? So thank you so much for sticking with us on this, like spending an hour with us this evening. I've really valued the questions, the comments, your engagement. Thanks so much to fellow panelists for your answers and thoughtful time and content. What comes next is you can expect to hear from us. So we are going to be communicating back with you with a couple of things. So we want to send you a little mini action toolkit so that if you were inspired by some of the content this evening, we're going to send you just a little toolkit with like, this is what you might say on social media. Here's some examples of how you can write a successful comment. Here's something that you could send in an email to your commissioner. So that you're able to take action and take those next steps. In that toolkit is going to be a 1, 2, 3 step guide that just says, here's how you submit your comment. Because while it is fairly easy, it's a little bit complex in terms of understanding how to navigate it. And so we want to make sure that we're helping step you through it. So that's what you're going to receive from us. And what we'd love to ask from you is, if you do submit a comment, if you do make that decision, will you please also share it with Adrian or Jess or someone on the Sun team? We'll make sure that Kate can see it as well. There's nothing that we will do with it necessarily. What it helps us is, we would love to see, what's your narrative? How are people talking about this? How can we talk about this in a way that really makes more sense to more people based on what your experiences are? And the last but not least important thing is, if you are interested and you want to share your message more broadly, and you'd like to, you're unafraid maybe, or maybe feeling like, yes, I want to share my story, Sun would love to work with you in terms of maybe submitting an op-ed or engaging with the press, because again, that public awareness, really raising and amplifying what is going on, is important. And so if you feel like you have some value to add, we'd love to work with you to make that happen. So I believe Adrian put his information in the chat, and maybe Jess as well. And if you are interested in that, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would love to work with you. And with that, I think that's what we've got for you this evening. We're right at 8. And just really appreciate you being here with us. And I don't know, Adrian, I'll pass it back over to you if we're staying on at all, if there's more questions or if anything else has come up.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of concludes the webinar for y'all tonight. I'm going to stay on for another 5 or 10 minutes just in case there's any last minute questions, or if you're feeling particularly inspired and want to write your comment right now and need any help with that, we would love to work with you. But otherwise, thank you so much for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
And for those of you who are staying to hear this last question, there was a question about, what is the end rate that they'll get to for the RCP?
Yeah, I was typing that answer right
Oh,
now.
okay, sorry.
So that the end rate updates every year based on the recent cost of utility scale solar farm. So it's actually utilities file their updated rate every year. For TEP and Unisource, it's about 3 cents per kilowatt hour in recent years, and for APS, it's about 5 cents per kilowatt hour. But that it's a moving target, so it is really difficult to, plan your potential investment in solar around a number that's changing every year.
And
Thank you, Kate. I
Jewel,
didn't know that, so that was good information.
Jewel, I don't know if you're still on, but yeah, feel free to give me a call tomorrow and we can talk through the grid access question you had. And I'm glad to hear you had some success with the mini splits. This is a really good question. Has anyone calculated the payback for adding storage? That's a little tricky, Steven. In part just because people use storage so differently, that it can take, a really long time. Like, a lot of people mostly use storage just for a source of backup power to have if they need it, if they are experiencing frequent utility outages. A lot of people more and more are using their batteries to help like offset some of those peak hours. So a lot of people will program their battery to kind of kick in right from 4 to 7 p.m. or 3 to 8 p.m. depending on their utility. And so that's certainly saving them money. The sort of break even on that is a little tricky to calculate, and it's definitely would be years and years and years. I don't know, Kate, JL, any thoughts?
No, I think that's a good assessment. It really depends on how much storage you need, and how you're planning to use it, for sure. So, that's something I always recommend getting a few quotes from different installers, and that's something an installer should be able to help you based on kind of your specific utility bill, be able to help you price it out.
And this is a little preview for you. It's not ready yet, but APS, TEP, and SRP actually are all working on putting together a virtual power plant program for battery storage. So customers with specific batteries who opt in, can share some of that battery storage during peak grid events. It's like times when the grid is really under strain. And then the utility will actually compensate you for sharing some of that battery storage. This hasn't really ever existed in Arizona before, and the utilities are all still working through the designs, but they'll be ready very soon. And we're very excited about those programs, in part because it actually provides some more direct compensation to battery owners. And hopefully that will help even more people proceed with that. What month did the grid access charge kick in?
I'm looking it up right now.
Okay, I was just about to.
March 8th, 2024.
Thank you.
And
So
really
quick, essentially your April utility bill.
Sorry, really quickly also about the storage rewards with APS, TEP, and SRP is that there is some nuance to that, and we're planning to host some webinars that surround that so that we can go over that nuance. Because, for example, somebody I spoke to about the program said that one of them, you pay a little bit more if you're using or you're sending your battery power to the company in question, the utility, in your bill, but you get a much bigger payout in the 2 seasons. So it is something to keep in mind if you need that money in a more imminent way, for example. So there are some considerations there, but we'll be explaining that in the future, and we'll send that out to, I assume, all of these attendees, but certainly all of our Arizonans, I hope.
Some really great questions, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. I'll hang on just a couple minutes longer, but otherwise I think we're kind of winding down. Thanks so much, everybody. And thank you, Jess, Kate, and Jeriel.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Have a great night.
And Alex, for the sake of time, if you're still here, for any malfunction with your panels, if your installer has gone bankrupt, unfortunately, that does mean that you have 2 options, both of which will unfortunately come out of pocket for you. You should still have the manufacturing warranty. And so in the event that that happens, the pieces, the parts will be covered by the manufacturer, but you will have to pay a service charge to another installer. And if that does happen, we can provide you with some examples. The alternative is that you can pay for an out-of-pocket or like a monthly charge to get a warranty through, I think it's called Solar Detect, for example. And so that would become a monthly charge, and it might not behoove you to go that route if you don't anticipate issues in the near future, for example. But that is an option so that you will have a warranty. It just unfortunately won't be the one that was already promised to you through your installer since they've now gone bankrupt.
So Stephen, you're asking about group storage buying programs. So you probably heard of our solar co-ops, which we run across the state, which is basically a solar bulk purchasing program for residential customers. Through all of those, we offer battery storage and EV chargers as well. To be honest, though, the discount for the battery storage isn't as great as the solar panel bulk discount. So it's not like we're getting people, a massive change, but it is, a little bit cheaper. I can't say that I've heard of EcoFlow, so I'm not sure what that is, but happy to look into it. Jess's cat taking front center. Alrighty, y'all. I'm gonna shut this webinar down. You've got our email in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us if you need anything. Okay.
All right, I'll look forward to your email then, Alex. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, Adrian, Kate, and Jeriel, too. You're all excellent speakers.
Thanks. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.